Hello, everyone. I'm Lucy Gallen, Associate Curator in the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art.
And I'm River Bullock. Currently, I'm the Beaumont and Nancy Newhall Curatorial Fellow, also in the Department of Photography at MoMA.
And we'd like to start by welcoming everyone. We're so happy that you're joining us for this Virtual Views conversation with artist Ito Barada in conjunction with our Artist Choice exhibition, which just recently opened at the museum on May 8th and will remain on view until January 9th. We want to give all the viewers a few minutes to tune in and get settled. So we'll begin with a short conversation between us, and then we'll turn to your questions.
So we're in conversation tonight with artist Ito Barada, with whom we've been working closely over these past months. Hi, Ito.
Hi, Ito. Hello.
So good to see you. Where are you calling from tonight?
I'm in my studio in Brooklyn.
We're so happy to be here with you. Before we get started, just a super quick introduction. Ito Barada. Ito is a Moroccan-French artist born in Paris. She grew up in Tangier and is currently based in Brooklyn and Tangier. Known for her multidisciplinary investigations of cultural phenomena and historical narrative, Ito's work includes photography, film, sculpture, prints, and installations. She works with textiles and natural dyes, and the list goes on. Ito is the founding director of the nonprofit Cinémathèque de Tangier, the city's first and only repertory cinema and archive. And of course, Ito is a filmmaker in her own right. She's made some 15 films. Her work has been exhibited internationally for over 2 decades, and MoMA is so fortunate to have numerous photographs by Ito in the collection. We're so glad to be here with you tonight.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
So glad. So before we really get started, we would like to give a special hello to MoMA members and donors joining us tonight. And by the way, if you are not already a member of the museum, please consider joining. Your commitment has a meaningful impact, and you can do this online at moma.org/join. We also want to acknowledge the Agnes Gund Artist's Choice Fund for making this exhibition and the long-running and beloved Artist Choice exhibition series possible. We're also extremely grateful for major support provided by the Modern Women's Fund and our community of annual exhibition fund donors whose support enables us to present collection-focused exhibitions year-round, including this exhibition, Artist Choice Ito Barada, A Raft. So like I said, for the first part of this program, we will be in conversation with Ito about her Artist Choice exhibition, which is currently on view. And then after we talk for a while, we'd be really glad to include questions from you. So please be sure to send your questions in the YouTube live chat section, and our producer will pass them along to me so we can include them. So hi, Ito. Okay, let's dive in. A first question for you. Why did you decide to call this exhibition A Raft?
So thank you. Thank you for having me. The exhibition is called A Raft because of Fernand Deligny's, that's the way he nicknamed his network of places where he lived with autistic nonverbal children. And the raft is something that is fragile. It's precarious. It's the opposite of the ship, the strong institution. It's about fragility. It's about loose connections. And at the same time, it's something that survives having big questions asked to it. So it's a figure that you find as the nickname of the places where this social worker, French social worker, the period we're focusing in the show is the 60s to the end of his life. So it's 30 years in rural France where he was, where he lived with autistic children.
Fantastic. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit how you first came to Delaney's work.
The first encounter is when I was at school. I was at I attended a seminar by Jean-François Chevrier, who's an art historian, at the Fine Art School, École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. A special seminar because it was open to anybody who wanted to attend, not just students of the program. And in that seminar, it was called Art and Information. Sandra Alvarez de Toledo was present, Anaïs Masson, the two founders, the two people who run the publishing company that republished Deligny's works in 2007, started. There's 7 books that were published since. But that's the first time we worked on, we had many guest lectures, and one of them was Sandra Alvarez de Toledo, who was working on Deligny at the time. So his concepts were familiar for us in that group, the group that includes photographer Patrick Fagenbaum, Maxence Richeflet, many of them who continued working together or who continued to be friends.
So Ito, thinking about the context of having an exhibition here at MoMA and bringing these objects that you talked about, Deligny's writings or his work with children, these things that were conceived outside of an art context, when we're bringing them into an exhibition here, we're looking at them next to art objects, objects from MoMA's collection. What was meaningful about that to you? What ideas did that bring forward?
Well, there was a big risk when you bring, when you associate things that have such different status. Documents from a very unique experiment that lasted many years, associated to art in the context of this institution. So I think one of the risks is to show the objects out of their context, out of their milieu. The other one is to, I mean, the main question is to think about the status of the different objects. Even as works of art, we have works that are performance documents, considered art, and then you have also documentations, documentation of a performance in the case of Knižák that is framed as a document. So what we did is we brought works of Deligny, who worked with language, with images, and with film during his whole life, writing about what he was learning. We brought, there's photographs, and one central piece, pieces, because there's many of them, are the maps that he started making or commissioning to the people that were working with him in the network. And those we put in 2 different kinds of vitrines. They're on both floors, on the 4th and the 5th floor. Ones are in light boxes. And the story of the maps called Wanderline, Ligne d'air in French, the story itself is very interesting. In 1969, a young electrician who was 20 years old, Jacqueline, joins him in his network. I'll have to come back later to the fact that he worked for institutions all his life, and that started as a school teacher. Remind me to go back to that. But Jacqueline joined him. Like many volunteers, they would live with the children, be there, available all day and all night. And when they joined him, they lived in an encampment a little lower from where he was. And Jacqueline shared the fact that he was having a lot of difficulty with the violence that the children were making themselves, physically hurting themselves. And Deligny had this idea that instead of dealing with his anxiety or the anxiety of the children, with words, why wouldn't he trace the movements. And that practice map all the movements that the children were doing. So that practice is going to become something regular in all the network of the different groups living among each other. Each person has a mapping zone, let's say. And in the case of the ones you're showing, there's 3 layers. They're made on transparent paper. First, there's the map of the main areas, and then there's the itineraries that are on top with zones that are particular and knots that become meaningful when it's one child, depending on the different periods. So the maps are different depending on the periods, but we have an important example, many examples from the big quantity of maps. And these are facsimile, they're not the originals.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the exhibition, this is the light table that you're seeing here that Ito was describing on the 5th floor in Gallery 518 at MoMA. And then downstairs, there's also other vitrines with other drawings and photographs from Delaunay's network. This right here, two vitrines. So right in the middle of MoMA's collection galleries are these objects from Delaunay's network and writings and books all brought together into the center of the room with art objects installed all around them. And, you know, maybe a related question that actually came in earlier today, one of the audience questions that was submitted in advance, was about, again, the intersections between art and then working with young people with disabilities. So from Tootsie Warhol, an audience member asked this question in advance that I think is related to what we were just talking about. This connection that you've made when you've put forward these objects and tracings, the Wanderlines drawings, for example, from Delaunay here in the context of art objects. And you already talked about some of the ways that even in the groups of art objects that we had, there's such diversity, like the documents of Milan Knížák, for example, versus photographs of a performance, say, or a drawing made by an artist. But seeing all of these approaches that the artist had next to Delaunay's work. Yeah.
There's many different gestures. And I think that's something we were attentive to in the choices we made. The 3 of us plus the 2 in France. And I have to say that we worked together for a long time, but in a very special context, because we didn't get to meet. None of us, I mean, the 5 of us never met. And the access to the collection came very late. So many things, I mean, there's a romantic view that, you know, I went through boxes, pulling out Twitters and voice from the storage. No, many choices were made in a cold distance way until we got in there further. So the gesture, this one that we're looking at is notes made for a choreography. So big round gestures that in Delaunay's project and then the practice that he was engaged with, one essential thing is that also led us, like many of his concepts through the collection, was to think outside language being a way of determining our humanity for a long time. And Delaunay starts by being a school teacher, works in psychiatric institutions for a long time. In the 60s, that's when for a start, he decides that these closed institutions are unbearable and decides to invent this model that we talked about, the raft. what he wants to trace and locate with these maps, with this new cartography or this new topography, is the humanity outside the language. So contrary to the definition, and to look for that. And in the spaces that are shared, the daily life is very important. Living together. I said earlier that the conditions of life were quite hard and precarious. And many of the rituals had to do with survival and living and surviving. So cutting wood, making fire. He also had these zones of, I wouldn't call them of play, but areas where the autistic children could act. And in the choices that we made, for example, the water is very important. The water is quite essential. And in the maps that were made, there was this idea that for Jean-Marie, for one important, one essential figure that you see in Ce Gamin-là, the film that we projected that he did with Renaud Victor. In this film, you see Jean-Marie, but there was this idea that the maps of the territory and the way he moved around would probably have a connection with the water, the underground water circuits.
Yeah.
And so these elements, there's a lot of elements that have to do with the territory where this experiment took place, and a lot of philosophical concept of his practices that also we shared from his writings. Many of his writings are still unpublished. One is has just been published, but not translated. And one idea that led this project was that there was only one of his books, The Arachnean, that was translated into English. His writings are available in French and in Spanish and in Portuguese. But for some curious reason, even though his thoughts are have attracted a lot of interest here, all the books are not translated. And we were very lucky during our project to have Robin McKay jump on board and do an incredible translation, retranslate even things we already had. A concept like the close presence became the nearby presence. And those specific exchanges on the words, because the language of Deligny is quite, it's hard and it's absolutely amazing in the way that it uses vernacular language in French, the way it's always dodging being in one place, the specificity of the play with word. I mean, there's a whole poetic pédagogie. I think there's a text by Sandra called Poésie pédagogique.
Yeah, and I just want to mention here for folks that Sandra and Anaïs, who Ito have mentioned, who we've been so fortunate to work closely with and who she's been in dialogue with for so many years about Deligny's work, have published so many of his books and writings in French, as she mentioned, so you can check that out. But in the exhibition itself, we have translated some of the terms that Deligny used and also quotes that Ito found. These have all been translated anew in English. So it has been really exciting.
And somehow also wrote many texts around the maps too.
Indeed, yes.
To give us as much context as possible of, so that there's not a dissociation between the Deligny years that we're talking about and the association that we make on the walls.
Yeah, so
different kinds of gestures around performance in the 60s, around objects.
Yeah, it's definitely so exciting to bring that forward for folks here in New York and through the exhibition. I wanted to ask also, we introduced ourselves at the beginning. We're curators in the photo department here at the museum. And as River mentioned in her introduction, we have photographs of yours in the collection, and many folks tuning in might know you from your work as a photographer. So I wanted to ask also if there were ways in which your work in photography intersects with some of the ideas that you've brought forward and explored here in this project.
Maybe not directly. I can say I have an experience working with documents and archives. I also did projects with Anaïs and Maxence when we were much younger, when we started working with photography and with groups of children in Tangier and in Marseille. That was a very different from this, but it was, I think the idea of alternative education is something that I'm very much interested in. And also different forms of education, different forms of communities, and the traces they leave. And I think also the questions of methodology of knowledge building, something questioning the very vertical, going down, up to down, and favoring the down from up. So that I think is my way of collecting information, traces, and also témoignage stories. As I worked on project, I think the allowing chance also to jump in building the project. I think that has to do with
Yeah, and maybe actually it's a good moment then to talk about some of these other amazing projects that you're working on right now. We wanted to make sure folks had a chance to hear about some of them. So right now you have a show of new work at Pace in East Hampton. It's on view through this weekend. And related in a way, I think, to some of the new work you're showing there, like collages of dyed textiles. One thing we would love to talk about is your dye garden in Tangier, which is an extraordinary place that you've been calling the mothership. You're calling the mothership. It's a botanic garden, a color research center, an artist residency.
Ooh, those are all very, very big.
Yeah. Tell us more about.
It's a beautiful place, but it's nothing pompous. It's nothing yet. It's meant to be. This is the site, so you don't see much because I wanted a picture where you see the location. It's the top of Africa, facing the border that is closed. That ocean that you see there is one of the biggest cemeteries today, and the coast of Spain is what you see, as if we were on the other side of a lake. And so this idyllic picture doesn't say much of the precarious situation of life in Tangier today, and even the art house cinema that we work in has been closed for a year, and all the green spaces in Tangier have been shrinking for many reasons, because the local politics don't protect them, and also the migrant population who arrives to the city from rural environment, and the idea of progress is to live, in houses, and unfortunately, there's a dispossession from the knowledge they have from their rural background. And one thing that I'd like to do is use the space that I have to gather people around questions of ecology, of research, and also have it be a pilot place where we can think about the policies and the relationship we have, the agricultural relationship we have with the European community, what we produce in Morocco, how we produce it, etc. So it's going to be a lab. The pretext is my desire to learn and unlearn and relearn old techniques of making dyes, pigments, and paints, a knowledge we had in North Africa that disappeared with chemical dyes. And so that's one part of it, but there's also a textile library, and that project is has started without having a name or a clear intent. It was just a place for gathering friends or people who need to work, and we're transforming it into something more formal in the months that I'm not there, because I go there in the summer. And of course, when you think about dyes, you also think about herbal medicinal gardens, because there's historically a strong relationship between those kinds of plant. So it's a place where plant illiteracy will be fought, and our wild side will be nurtured and developed, hopefully for the 20 next years.
Yes.
So excited.
Yeah. Can't wait to
Another, another project I know you're working on is a collaboration with Bettina, and one of her works we were fortunate to include in the exhibition. Let me see, it's slide 32.
Bettina Grossman.
So I had the total honor of welcoming her to the exhibition last week, and this is one of her photographs, 2 hours in the life of one hair. But you're working on an extended project with her. Can you share a little bit?
Yes, I'm doing a book with Gregor Hubert. Last October, we won an award for best book dummy for young artist at Luma at the Rencontre d'Art.
Woohoo, young artist.
Young artist. And I discovered Bettina's work a few years ago in a film my neighbor made, Corinne van der Roche. It's called The Lady with Black Balloons, and I was very interested in discovering more of her work. Bettina still lives at the Chelsea Hotel. She's 93, and she hasn't, for many reasons, she hasn't showed a lot of her work. She has been producing in the darkroom bedroom where she lives. And I was lucky enough to have access to her wonderful portfolios, and decided to reorganize a monography on her work. And so we're finishing it. I just a few days ago discovered stained glass in Chartres in France. A master wrote to tell Bettina that her work from 1970 was ready and that she could pick it up. It's a letter 2014, and everything's intact. And so, yeah, Bettina has been filming a lot, also photographing, and I was very happy to include one of her circular, vernacular, concrete drawings with hair in the exhibition.
Yeah, and we are all benefiting from all of the work that you and Gregor are doing as we're learning more about her work and her contributions.
The book will be published by Xavier Barral, the publisher, EXB, in the fall.
Can't wait. I don't know how you're doing all of these things at once. Oh, there it is. This is an install view from a corner of the exhibition where Bettina's work is there, and other works from the collection, and Ito's photographs also. And actually, you know, this comes to an audience question. So I think we're going to start to bring in some of the questions that have come in now. And an audience question, actually, Scott has asked about your work with children and youth in your own work. And in fact, some of those photographs that were in that install view were sewing exercises. And the connection maybe then with work with children or living with children that is at the center of this exhibition, and maybe your interest in that.
I wouldn't make any direct link.
Yeah.
But I can describe the choices of these print and this series.
Yeah.
These are photographs made by young women who are learning how to sew. And so they're prints, photographic prints, but they're made from sheets of paper that are perforated by a sewing machine without the thread. So Bettina next to me had the hair, and there's no thread to make that negative. And they're a little bit like the Froebel exercises that you have from kindergarten. It's a curriculum, and the curriculum is many different shapes and forms, all quite straight. And so there's the traces that you see that are white are pen markings, and then in transparency, if you look close, there's holes and tear everywhere.
Right.
So this is more like a photography of a found object, but it has to do with labor, with mechanization, with children being prepared to work in factories, clothes factories for many of them, like the maquilladoras that you have in Mexico. Tangier is a zone where a labor that is favored for young women is working in shrimp or textile factories.
Yeah, I remember the shrimp from some of your other photographs. So another question that's come in is about something that you mentioned earlier about language and about working outside language. And the question is about the relationship between language and your own work and your interest in language as an idea.
In Dorini's case, in the network and in the absence of language makes the maps essential, because they're the traces that are going to make visible the invisible. And so the presence of images, in his case, his interest for the image, is also something that would, because they're filming all the time. And we organize a film program with Sandra and Anaïs, but there's also a lot of Super 8s that they just discovered, and two writers who just are working on his last writings were on cinema, but not on filming. He invented this neologism, caméré, I think Robert Kramer translated by camera-ing. It's also about filming nothing. So you see that we're always chasing, redefining, we're always at the border. He's always coming from a different direction. And I think that for me is something very interesting. In the texts, in the last text that he wrote on cinema, he says that imagery, the image might have an animal origin, and his interest in ethology and behavior of animals. There's something wild about the image. I'm not sure I understood yet all of these concepts after many years of practicing. But I'm starting to feel them. I'm not sure my brain understands them, but the films are very helpful. Don't miss the film program, because experimental films are mind-blowing.
And actually in the exhibition itself, you've made this wonderful juxtaposition between Segam and La, which is projected on one wall, and we hear Delany's voice, and it has been translated by Robin also, so those of us who aren't as great with French can read some of the text there. But it's there amidst a lot of other works from the collection about language. So you've made that connection in space in the exhibition too, in an exciting way. So there's some other questions. River, did you want to jump on?
So one coming in from our colleague Prue. She's asking or saying, MoMA's collection is vast. How did you approach the question of where to start looking? even if you had a theme or guiding principles, where to begin.
I had
Yeah.
many false starts.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
you already talked about the crazy timing with the pandemic. You know, River and I and Ito, I think you were like, we all were together with Ito in her studio. One of the
Just
last things
before
we did
shutdown.
was,
Just before.
yeah,
Yeah. You were planning to go to Morocco.
yeah.
And well, once I think what there are two ideas I had from the beginning is to work with friends, to use this pretext, and that's something I do as much as possible. Only work with the people I want to work with, or have people join me when I'm invited in a project. I find. I find that even though I was a bit familiar, but this allowed me to learn a lot more about working with Sandra and Anaïs and you two. And even though I was very familiar with the maps, with the wonder lines, it wasn't as clear as it is today that they're not outsider art, they're not drawings in the artistic sense, they're not therapeutic documents, they're experimental objects in a way that are meant to expel language outside and leave a trace of what's common. So the idea of the common in his work is what in the beginning led us. And the first word I looked for on the database of the collection is commune. And common, and that's the way it went. There were some obvious, like Bruce Nauman, when I told Sandra, do you want to join? That was one of her dreams, to associate them. Deligny, his maps have been showed in exhibitions before. In Reina Sofia, the Didier Berman Atlas exhibition, they were part of the different maps. There was an exhibition in Sao Paulo.
Yeah, with Luis.
But not in that context where you have access to such a huge collection with works from completely different, from the afterwar, which is Deligny's period. There's very, very different periods articulated together. The clay that you see over there, the two clays, the birds, or the Michaud.
Yeah. And so there were certain works that became quite important. You were mentioning
They're pivots. I think they were pivots.
Nauman for Sandra and Anaïs was absolutely essential. But there's also a question coming in from Laura Lalinde. Did you discover any artists through putting together this show? Did organizing a show make you see any artists you knew differently? So at the same time, maybe there were these fixed pivots. There were also, of course, unexpected things.
Can we show the picture of the pocket drawings?
We don't have
We don't have it. Well,
you can put a picture, an install view of the language wall, and you will see it there. Yeah.
The works that I was very happy to have, and I'll talk about one that I didn't have because some curator put it somewhere else.
So this is what happens when you're organizing something from the collection at MoMA. Sometimes you can't install everything exactly where you want to, and sometimes new things come up.
So what was important was to try to show works that haven't been showed too many times, do associations that were fertile for the territory where we were working. And so the discoveries for me is the Anastasie drawings that you see in the beginning, right next to
the Edward sculpture.
Yeah, and the Louise Bourgeois on top, the weaving word on top, and the Anastasie pocket drawings are just folded drawings, folded papers put in his pocket, walking in the street with a pencil, making a trace on the folded paper, and then starting again, folding it again, putting it in the blank space. So it's an association between trace and chance. That was a very important piece. I think, in the shapes than we have. In the zone upstairs, in the raft zone, I think the Eva Hesse piece, the little sculpture made of terracotta, I think still moves me very much since the first time I saw it. And of course, when you see these treasures, they're not very much accessible. They're in huge boxes, protected. So also the experience of seeing them is not at all the way you will be experiencing them. And I just discovered that these, the Eva Hesse sculpture,
which is in the middle
reminded me
here.
that happens after, the small sculpture of like these little cups. They look a lot like the Iranian qanat, which are water citadels that are 3,000 years old. I wonder if she saw them.
Wow.
So it's interesting when you know the story of Jacqueline. There's lots of lines and threads that are pulling that weren't intentional. And I think that was outside the work of choosing and installing in a space and having the works dance together. There's things that happen after you do it that are interesting, and the conversations that continue.
Yeah, so many threads across the space. So you just were talking just now about the parts of the process, like choosing works and installing them. But someone, Eric, has asked a question about research in your process. And even beyond, I mean, the question here mentions that even beyond this exhibition, some of your projects engage historical figures or past events or phenomena. And they're asking about the role of research in your artistic process.
Many projects I start working on are determined by the idea that I don't know much and I discover something strange or that I should know that everybody else knows, you know, like the existence of dinosaurs in Morocco. I discovered in an auction that there was a dinosaur that had a Moroccan name. I had never heard of Moroccan dinosaurs. It's very different from the American relationship to this, you know, national totem that you have. We had even bigger dinosaur, more ferocious than you. And we didn't have enough, we didn't have stamps with them, and we didn't have, you know, posters at the airport celebrating the road.
Those normal tokens of importance, yes.
Yeah, so the absence of or the dichotomy between something very familiar and something that's absent is going to lead, I think, to research. And I'll try to associate science with oral history, with myths, with and I think it's a loose, it's a thorough, but it's also a loose way of working on a long journey, because you don't know in advance what are going to be the things you're going to keep. In the Dinosaur Road project, for example, I ended up being more interested in fossil forgers and in celebrating their talent than the reality of the country being robbed from its fossils and the economy of the fossils. So I went down the line of the economic line. But they're also very much open-ended projects. So the research has many ramifications, and one project can be start and end in a specific material that also guides the direction that I'll take. And film and photography are always present. They're not the end, but they're often the beginning. And the projects can continue. They're porous, one another, and they're usually ongoing. The end is a book. That's one possible form. A poster is another, and an exhibition because of the constraint of the deadline.
Oh yes, deadlines.
The fortunate and the unfortunate, because it allows you to get there, to make choices. That's all.
Yeah. Another question has come in from someone named Sarah that it seems like they're following some of the things that you've been up to recently. For example, they saw that you were working on the Wide Awake Soup Truck recently. So they are asking if you could talk about the relationship between art and a kind of activism, if that comes up at all.
Yeah, I wouldn't call that activism. I just gave a hand. I made food a couple of times and served more than I made food. And I had never made food before at all. So for a first time, having to cook for 300 people with people who think you know how to cook, that was quite quite an adventure. I more seriously,
Yeah.
and especially this week, and especially with what's been happening in the West Bank and Gaza, and the massacres in Gaza, to name them clearly. It's been very hard to continue hearing the silence of many institutions. Some wonderful artists have stepped up, and I've learned a lot about being here today in America, in New York, and seeing how part of the narrative of the Palestinian people were completely silenced. I have heard of it from many long time, but I had never experienced it by being here. And I think in an institution like MoMA, what's interesting for me, when you bring experiences like Deligny, I think the question is not so much, is Deligny in the right place in the Museum of Modern Art? It's a temporary exhibition. He's not in the museum. It's a temporary exhibition. He's not part of the collection, and it's an artist's choice. But what I would like to see is if Deligny's way of looking, if Deligny can bring something to the museum, if he can move some of the lines, if the way of collecting, if curators can learn from that experience, I think that would be something very successful. Deligny was a communist, and he lived after the war, and I think his distance and his reinvention of a world is something that can be, and his clarity, even for very complex, that's something that's very interesting to see.
Yeah,
I'm curious to see what he brings.
Other possibilities.
From the tools that, that are available. Thank
you, Ito, for that answer and talking about these things here and now, and about, I think oftentimes with artist choice exhibitions, we all see the new ways of looking at things that artists or others outside of the curators have brought to looking at the collection. And what you've done on top of that by bringing in the model of Deligny and his approach is another layer of looking at new possibilities for all of us, for sure. With that great answer and way of thinking, I think maybe we'll just have time for one last question. River, maybe you want to take the last question, and I think there's some opportunities to talk about film, especially because, as Ito mentioned, we have this film program coming up that we want to say something more about.
Yeah, so the exhibition, of course, includes, as you mentioned, Segamen La, which is just one of the films connected to Deligny. And you've constellated it with these other works from the collection. So Gordon Matta Clark's Firechild, a 1969 collaboration between Joyce Wieland and Michael Snow, Dripping Water, two of Bruce Naumann's studio films that we've looked at. And of course, film is important to your own practice. And so I guess I'm wondering if we could just talk a bit more about the importance of film to your practice, of it to Deligny. We began to start, talk about that a little bit. And then also, just so exciting to look forward to this Carte Blanche, the virtual cinema program that you're organizing, again, in collaboration with Sandra.
Sandra and Anaïs, yeah.
Yeah.
So there are 3 Deligny films. Ce Gamin-là, which is visible in the galleries, but because it's a bit long, it's better to see it ideally in a theater. I have to say that it's very strange for someone who runs a cinema to do these programs at distance. So ideally, at least use a screen as big as possible. Yeah. There's the Gamin-là, there's Projet N, and there's the least gesture, the moindre geste. We've added some other films. One that is will be specially and premiere by Florian Fouché, who's working on a Manifeste Jean-Marie, who's been working with the ideas of Deligny. And I have to say that Sandra and Anaïs Laractin have a project space. They also curate shows. And in their project space, Florian showed the beginning of his project based on Deligny's work and on his father and in relationship to Jean-Marie. And he's doing a special format version, finishing the film just for us to premiere it at MoMA.
Can't wait. Yeah, so the film program launches June 3rd, coming up on MoMA's Virtual Cinema, which you all can access. So look out for all those details soon. We will share them with you. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to all of us, on behalf of all of us, for joining us this evening. For anyone who couldn't be here, this video is now going to be up on MoMA.org, so people can access it. And remember, you can stay up to date with everything that's happening at the museum on Magazine at MoMA.org, where you'll find more information about Ito's exhibition and this upcoming virtual cinema program that we just talked about. River and I really appreciate all the tremendous help from our colleagues across the museum who have worked to make this evening and the exhibition possible. We really want to give a special shout out to our beloved photo department colleagues and to others at the museum across departments who've worked closely with us and with Ito on the exhibition, including Hiroko Ishikawa, and Chloe Capewell, and Ellen Conti, and Sydney Briggs, and so many more colleagues in the museum. And in particular, we want to thank the AV team and Sean Yetter and Prue Pfeiffer for making this conversation this evening possible. Most of all, Ito, we want to thank you. But we also—
Can I add a word?
Sure, add a word.
So you cut?
One
Yeah.
last word. Yeah.
One last word. No, I wanted to, because I didn't get a chance to thank all of you and the Deligny Network, Gisèle Durand-Ruy, who gave us permission to use the documents and the map, because she's the ayant droit of the Deligny. And one word when I was talking about activism and art is, I think the word that I couldn't find and I just found it is invisibility. I think what Deligny does is to find ways of render visible invisibilities. And that's something that I hope contaminates in a way with new cartographies, the way we look at art in the museum.
Thank you, Ito. Thank you so much. And thank all of you for joining us tonight. Thanks. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.